So I'd like to welcome everybody to the inaugural event of Collecting Clues. This is a co-production of Creating Conversations Bookstore in Redondo Beach and the Men of Mystery organization. We are hoping that this is the first in a series of events with authors, but if it ends up being our only one, at least it's with Neal Griffin, whom we all adore and appreciate. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Collecting Clues hosts and Men of Mystery co-chairs, Jan Wilcox and Cindy Woods.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can see me or not. Today we have the great honor of focusing the spotlight on Neal Griffin, author extraordinaire. Neal has a wealth of experience, having been in the Marine Corps, graduating from the prestigious FBI National Academy in Quantico, along with his 25 years of law enforcement in various capacities, and retiring as a senior lieutenant in a 150 officer department. So with all those credentials, it's no surprise that Neal has written from his first book, The Benefit of the Doubt, and his second, A Voice from the Field, his third, From His Own Hand, and now his fourth and current book, The Burden of Truth. I'm supposed to hold up the book. Ta-da. And let's see. It is an honor to introduce to you, Neal, an excellent writer and one of the most genuine individuals that I've had the pleasure of meeting. Neal, thank you very much. And
thank you, Jan.
You're welcome. And now I would also like to introduce to you Cindy Woods, the co-chair of Men of Mystery.
Hello. I'm Cindy Woods. I'm the co-chair of Men of Mystery with Jan Wilcox, as she said, and I have the honor of introducing our interviewer for today, Rich Ehisen. He's an award-winning journalist, editor, and public speaker who spent more than 25 years interviewing and reporting on politicians, athletes, authors, CEOs, celebrities, artists, cops, doers, and dreamers all over the country. He's the managing editor of the State Net Capital Journal, a LexisNexis publication that covers all 50 state houses, and his freelance work has appeared in a variety of publications across the country. His blog, The Open Mic, features his interviews with writers of all kinds, including New York Times bestsellers Jonathan Mayberry, Christopher Moore, R.L. Stein, J.E. Jantz, Jess Walter, Tracy Clark, Kelly Garrett, and of course, Neal Griffin. Please take it over. Thank you so much, Rich, for being with us.
Well, thank you, ladies. I really appreciate it. And I've been looking forward to this for weeks here. Neal's a good friend. He's a fabulous writer, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So, hey, let's jump right into it, right? Neal, first thing, congratulations. I mean, you're getting fabulous reviews on the book. I just finished it myself, and I have to tell you, as much as I've loved all of your work, I really do think this is your finest effort. This is, I really, really enjoyed it. You barely put it down. So I wanted to tell you, though, I want to ask you, I should say, start out. I mean, your number one character, Omar Ortega. Tell me a little bit about this character.
Sure. First off, everyone, thanks for being here. This is wonderful. And thanks to Creating Conversations and Men of Mystery for the invitation. Yeah, and this is, Rich, I appreciate the compliments. And yeah, this is a different book for me. And when you want to talk about Omar Ortega, what I would first want to point out is that he is pure fiction. But at the same time, I've met dozens of young men just like him. Omar is a man that I met a lot of times under really great circumstances, and I was in a situation to have a really great relationship. But there are other occasions where I met men like Omar across the table in an interrogation room. And they were trying to explain how they wound up in that car or on that street corner. And their explanation would very often send them to jail, or in some cases, state prison. Some of them are candidly still there. So I think what I would want people to know about Omar is he's like a lot of young men who's walking what I call that hazardous middle lane of barrio street justice. Off to one side of the cops, and when they see Omar, they might think that he's one of the bad actors and up to no good. And on the other side are the gang members who, when they see Omar, they see a kid who should have already jumped in. He should be putting in the work and paying the tax. Now, to say that these two sides, the cops and the gang members, are at war is no exaggeration. So Omar's stuck in the middle. So he's what I call, he's walking on the knife's edge in a zero-sum game with very little room for error. So I think he's an intriguing character, and I've been very anxious to introduce him to the world.
I absolutely agree. Very intriguing character, and I did want to show people, I am reading the book. You should read the book too. But Omar, of course, isn't the only pivotal character here. Sheriff's Deputy Travis Jackson is also a very key character here. Mm-hmm. And as he has been in previous books of yours. Mm-hmm. So tell me more about him, because this time you really got into the struggles he's having in his own life, in his domestic life, and how that affects him being able to do the job. What was your thinking with that? And then, what prompted you to pull him out of Wisconsin and drop him into sunny Southern California?
Yeah, for people who might not be familiar with my first three novels, they're all set in Wisconsin, and Travis was a character there. But I wanted to write a true-to-life fiction book, which means I wanted to put it in San Diego. I wanted to put it in a real community with a real organization, the San Diego Sheriff's Office. So I decided to, in my last book, by his own hand, to have Travis put in an application. As he says, he wants to go run with the big dogs for a while. No offense to small-town law enforcement, but Travis wanted to try and come out here to San Diego, and he gets hired by the Sheriff's Office. So 2 years have gone by since that time, and now Travis is here. And as Rich alluded to, he's had his issues in making that transition. It's not gone quite as smooth as he thought he would. But the interesting thing I'd want to point out about Travis, first off, I like Travis. He's a great cop. He was a good cop in Newburgh, and I think he's doing a great job out here in San Diego. But he's interesting in that he lives out in the suburbs. He would live up in Temecula, and he just comes into Vista. So his only real connection to the community is a badge and a gun, his job. He comes in for 40 hours a week and does his patrol work. He doesn't shop in Vista. His kids don't go to school in Vista. They don't live in Vista. And that's indicative of a lot of law enforcement these days. In fact, about 60% of cops don't live in the communities they police. So Travis is very typical of a go-getter, a hard-charging patrol cop working in North County, San Diego, and coming in and doing his job. And it's high-speed, low-drag kind of work. So I like Travis a lot. He's a good cop.
And I wanted to ask you about one more character, and that would be Ellie Peralta. A lot of male writers get criticized for how they write female characters, and to be honest with you, a lot of times they deserve that criticism. But I've always been very impressed with how you write female characters. They're always fully formed, three-dimensional, actual, living, breathing human beings. They're not just there to be victims. They're not just there to be, window dressing or some accoutrement to men. And so I'm impressed by that, especially in crime fiction. Tell me a little bit about how you developed that character and how that fits into your overall approach when you're writing female characters, because we all know you've had other very strong female characters in your previous books as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rich, and it's interesting because yes, I have I've written major characters that are women police officers, and I have gotten a lot of great feedback. In fact, Tia Suarez has been probably the most popular character in my Newburgh series. She's a great cop. Ellie's a little different, but what I would point out is this is a very male-dominated work environment, police work. It's about 80% men. But the women who are in police work are integral in the department. And I think the trick, and I would, I guess, show my hand here, is that the trick to writing a good woman police officer is remember what women police officers want. They don't want to be women police officers. They want to be police officers who just happen to be women. And that is not a fine distinction. I mean, the fact is that they want to be treated just like anyone else. But what I would want people to notice in the development of Ellie is she isn't treated like everyone else. And it just simply, that's the case. And women find themselves in that circumstance a lot. So Ellie just wants to go about and do her business, but all the baggage that she might be stuck with is backstory. So that's not on her, that's on the cops around her. So I think the trick, Rich, is just write them as police officers, and gender is secondary.
I'll remind people, feel free to put a question in. Jan and Cindy, though, I will notice I'm not seeing my name come up in the chat for people if they wanted to send me a question directly. I don't know if you need to do anything there, but we are going to take some questions later. I have plenty for Neal, but we definitely want to get to yours too. Let's talk about the publication process here, because you know, we've known each other a long time, and I know this one actually got delayed quite a bit. That's not unusual in this industry at all. And while I'm sure that was frustrating to see things get pushed back, given the subject matter and everything that's going on in society right now with the focus on police conduct, it seems to me like it actually maybe has worked out in your favor. The timing has worked out in your favor. Tell me a little bit more about the timing of this story and how you had to approach this story. You're thinking about it right from the beginning.
You know, it is right now. It is an interesting time once again in the way law enforcement is in the X, if you will. We're on the crosshairs of the public, and I think a lot of people in law enforcement are being painted with a very broad brush right now, which is kind of interesting because certainly law enforcement gets accused of that pretty frequently, that they're the ones that are doing the profiling. Well, I think right now police officers are feeling, you know, the 600,000 men and women who police this country are feeling like they're under the microscope. All that said, when it comes to the story of Omar Ortega and the way he has to live his life, there's no bad time to tell that story, because Omar's story is happening every day in cities across America, where particularly young men find themselves in really difficult circumstances. They find themselves in real precarious situations that, as I said, it allows for no margin of error whatsoever. Whereas my kids are practically wrapped in bubble wrap. You know, they'd have to really go out of their way to find trouble. And for Omar, it's around every corner. So I don't think there's a bad time to tell that story, because it's a story that in this country, it just never seems to get old. It just keeps playing itself out. And it's not a story that people should take lightly. It's something I think we should all be willing to confront.
You know, the story feels very close to the bone for you. It feels personal, which I understand. As you know, my brother was a cop. I think I have an understanding of what cops experience and how personal it is often, the work that you do, and how often it needs to be that way. How important was it for you to write this story, this specific story, in the specific way that you did it? Because there's a lot of nuance here. There are some genuinely bad people, but there's lots of shades of gray here. So tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, as I said, this is a story that I wanted to tell this story for a very long time. This story has been ruminating in my head for years. But I don't think and I appreciate you saying that, Rich, that it feels closer to home. It feels more personal. And I think that it is. And I think it is because of what I just described, that I met a lot of young men like Omar, and they still kind of walk around in my head a lot. But I think it's also, it's probably I don't think I would have been able to write the story to resonate the way that I hope it does without the relationship that I have in my own family with my wife. My wife of 20 years is a first generation immigrant. She's Latina. Her parents immigrated from Mexico, and they lived in Salinas, which is a pretty hard knocking town. Lettuce capital of the world, she's always proud to claim, home of John Steinbeck. But her dad worked the fields. Her mom worked in a fish processing plant. And my wife's first language was Spanish. She went to school not understanding any English. And certainly her family has some stories to tell that are unlike Omar's story. But for her, with her tenacity and her parents' hard work, she wound up going to Santa Clara University. She wound up working for Price Waterhouse. She owned her own business. She's a 3-term elected official. But she had to fight for every bit of it. She had to fight for everything, and she continues to have to fight. But if I relied on my experiences, if I relied on my experiences to try and understand Omar's situation, I mean, I grew up in a very a gifted home, if you will. The life that was gifted to me, the life that's been gifted to my children, is entirely different than Omar. So I think what you're picking up on, and I appreciate that, is probably the influence I've had in the last 20 years of being able to walk in my wife's world, and that's been very enlightening for me.
Well, along those lines, you mentioned that Omar's completely fictional, but you've known lots of inspirations for Omar. That said, when you sat down to write this story, did you have the plot in mind, or did you start with Omar the character and build that around him? As a storyteller, where did you start?
Yeah, that's good. I think I can answer that question by telling you this: that for much of this book, for much of the iteration from putting pen to paper and publication, in my mind, the title of this book was The Book of Omar. That was always in my head because it's Omar's story. It's very character driven. It's driven almost exclusively by the character of Omar Ortega and people interacting in his world. Eventually, The Burden of Truth, which I think captures the story in a much deeper level, was the title that we settled on. But this book has always been, to me, the story of the life and times of a young man named Omar Ortega. So yeah, character driven for sure.
We are, of course, since we're all here on Zoom, we all understand we're in the middle of a pandemic, which has changed our world. As Jan and Cindy noted, we normally would be sitting all together in a nice building having an in-person conversation. We're not. So it has driven most of us to nonstop immersion in the news cycle. And it can be overwhelming. And especially for people who rely on their creativity to make a living. And we've talked in the past, the discipline that it takes to write books in the best of times. Now, of course, we're not in the best of times. So have you, and if so, how have you approached your ability to stay creative and to be disciplined about the craft of writing during this incredibly challenging time we're all living through?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention Zoom because this is this experience right here. You know, none of us humans, I think, do very well in isolation. It's actually, an old ancient form of torture, right? To cut yourself off, wall yourself off from the world. And probably, my favorite part of being a writer is to connect with readers and connect with other writers, but readers as well, and to have that connection. To talk with people about the power of a well-told story. So this is different for sure. And you're right, there are a number of different distractions going on for sure. But I think I'm probably luckier than, say, my barber or the people that own a really great little restaurant that we like to go to down the road, or for that matter, booksellers who are working so hard to keep that connection going, right, between writers and readers. And I appreciate that so much. And it's really almost exclusively these independent bookstores. All that said, writing is a solitary sort of endeavor, so I'm used to it. And yes, you're right, you have to be very disciplined in the distractions. My method that works really well for me is to get up early. To the last thing I do at night is to try and read where I'm leaving off at. And then the next morning, get up, get a cup of coffee, and get on the computer and put my head into what I'm writing. And right now I'm writing a prequel to an earlier novel. So I want to walk right in and live in 1970. And I find if I let myself start messing around on the internet or reading the news or going to my favorite podcast, the next thing I know, I'm in that spiral. So it is a matter of discipline. But again, I don't think the challenges are as great for me as they are for a lot of people in the world right now who are just, their whole worlds have been turned upside down. I just need to stay focused and keep writing. And that's what I do. I just try and really focus on what I'm trying to accomplish that day.
It's not easy, though, to do that. As I say, even in the best of times, it's challenging. Because we're also in very polarized times. And a lot of writers have become very reluctant to speak out. We're all on social media, sometimes way too much on social media. And it's a fabulous tool for writers to market themselves, market their books, interact with their readers and fans, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of writers are really reluctant to speak out on anything to do with politics or social issues, and, out of fear that it's going to alienate half of their audience. And they may be right, But you've always been incredibly open and honest in sharing your views and perspectives on the world. And by the way, respectful. And I really appreciate that, because clearly that's part of the problem, as we see so often these things these days devolve into things that are the opposite of respectful. But even so, you're going to find people who vehemently disagree with you, who are going to take any position that you take as offensive. And we both have colleagues who have gone through that, where they've seen their book sales or their reviews get hammered over something they did. The question there is, does it concern you at all that when you're sharing, your thoughts and feelings on things in the world, that it's going to harm you as a writer, it's going to harm your sales, it's going to drive away people? Is that something that you ever think about?
Think about, for sure, but I don't. But see, the thing is, that's why I write. That's why I write, to try and. I guess I'm bragging, or I guess it's just a part of my history that I think is relative to my writing. Is I was raised by a pacifist Quaker philosophy professor, and that's my dad. And he taught all 5 of his kids to not only question authority, but to challenge authority. And as you can imagine, in the Marines and as a cop, it's funny because what I always term that the idea of being having a 35-year public service career in the Marines and in the police department, that's a long time to go without ever saying what's really on your mind. And that's a lot about what public service is. It's duty first, and your opinion, you can just stow it. So I went through a lot of that, but when it came time to start writing, what I knew I wanted to do was to challenge people's assumptions, to make them question their assumptions about things that they think they know, things that they're absolutely certain of. I certainly did that in benefit of the doubt with an incident of a young man by the name of Ben Sawyer, who commits an act of police brutality that's so egregious and so unforgivable that he's that new poster boy for police brutality. And I think I did that through all my novels, and I'm certainly doing that with Omar Ortega. And it's a good question, Rich, because I think there's a potential that some police officers here in San Diego may, and maybe there's some here right now, that might take some offense. And if they do, I would only say that I think I know well enough to be able to write that part of the story realistically. And the other side of the coin is I think a lot about, what was it that Atticus Finch said about you have to understand another man, you have to crawl inside his skin and walk around for a while. And I certainly try to do that with characters like Omar. And I think some people might wonder where the hell I get off as a approaching senior citizen white guy trying to write in the mind of an 18-year-old Latino. And I get that. So all that said, I think that that there is, I've never felt like I wanted to back away from it. I like challenging people's assumptions. I like making people really question their convictions. I hope I do that in my writing, and that's what I really enjoy in the back and forth with readers. And I would just say, we'll finish with this, that I was recently, I got a Facebook direct message from a woman who's already read The Burden of Truth, and she was very kind, and she talked about how much she enjoyed the book and how empathetic she felt. She had never thought about Omar's position before, and she finished the book wondering what she could do to help someone that would be in Omar's situation. And then she saw in the back of the book I'd written an author's note. And in that author's note, I just happened to mention that I was lucky enough to be associated with the Police Athletic League in my old department. And I made the kind of the snide comment that I wished PAL, Police Athletic League, was funded with the same sort of enthusiasm as a SWAT team. Because I can tell you they're not. And anyway, based on her experience with the book and that, she made a contribution to her local police department's Police Athletic League. So I was very touched by that. And if that's, if that's the kind of reaction people have to this story, either positively or maybe, again, it challenges some of the ways they think we treat people in this country or whatever it might be, I'm okay with that. So I guess that's kind of your question was, do I worry about it? And I realize it, but actually that's the reason I like to write. I like to challenge what people think they know and give them a new way of seeing things.
Remind folks, definitely open for your questions. I haven't seen any come in yet. I'm looking. So if you have one, Now, while we're waiting for that, though, let me follow up on that a little bit, because there we were talking about the external of how people might react to things you say away from your writing. But every form of writing has parameters and things that readers come to expect. And I think in crime fiction, where the protagonist is a cop, that's particularly true. And it's one of the things I really like about your books. It's very much like somebody we both really like, Joseph Wambaugh, where you don't have that. They challenge that, not just the, you challenge the expectation also in maybe breaking out of some of those conventions a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Not all cops are completely heroic. Not all bad guys are completely bad. Not all of anybody is completely anything. How much do you think of that when you write, of thinking, okay, I know that this is what the trope is, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something different.
Yeah. Well, no, there's not a police officer in the Burden of Truth that I think is a stretch. You know, there's a character, Sean Murphy. He's a great cop. I mean, Sean's a little over the top. He's probably been working the gang team a little too long. Maybe needs to come up for air and do some other work. And you can see that in the way he goes about his job. So I think there might be some people that would look at Sean Murphy. In fact, I know there are, and think that he's, for lack of a better term, quote unquote, a bad cop. And I would simply say I disagree. I mean, I recognize some of the things he's doing that are questionable and shouldn't be done, and he should be held to answer for it. He should be accountable for it. But at the same time, he's a complete character. Like you said, I think it's better to write a character that is realistic than to try and have these cookie cutters, I guess, of characters. So you mentioned Travis's troubles at home, Sean's kind of questionable ethics, if you will, and even Omar. Omar could have made his life a lot easier. From my perspective, again, as a person who's never walked in Omar's shoes, he could have made his world a lot easier, but he chose not to, and that's what started the spiral. So yeah, I try and show people from every angle that I can, for sure.
We're getting some questions, so this is why I slip on my glasses so I can see what I'm actually reading here, and I want to get people's names right. I apologize profusely in front if I mess somebody's name up. Kathy Rokiki, I hope I'm saying that right, asks, she says, I'm interested in the transition, to Marine from, to, I guess, becoming a Marine from being in a pacifist household. How did that go? And how and why? How did you come to join the Marines after the upbringing that you had?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and I wish my dad was still around to hear it. I don't know. I think I was probably rebelling like a lot of kids, and the one thing that would probably get to my dad better than anything was for, again, literally a pacifist Quaker preacher who ended up getting his PhD in ancient religions and taught philosophy at the University of Wisconsin. So I always tell people, when that's your family, that's a very small cohort group. not a lot of, he wasn't a firefighter or a cop or any of those things. He was a philosophy professor, and it's funny because there were no simple conversations with my dad. And so to say we had a strained relationship would probably be an understatement. But then again, I have a 15-year-old boy now, so I think a lot about that. But so when I was 19 years old, I think I was probably pretty much wondering what would be the best way to kind of stick it to him, and I thought joining the Marines. But the real part about joining the Marines was I knew that was a way that I could eventually become a police officer. And see, I was one of those kids that in 1970, picked up a book called The New Centurions by Joseph Wambaugh. And I had no business reading that book at 10 years old, trust me. But I did get my hands on it. And once I did that, I knew that I had to be a cop. And I figured that a good way to become a police officer would just be to spend some time in the Marines. And sure enough, the day after I discharged, I started the police academy. So, and in the end, what's funny about that, and I really do appreciate the question, and it makes me think of my dad, because we ended up having a wonderful adult relationship. He just passed a few years ago, but he was a wonderful Marine father. He came to see me in Okinawa. He came to see me in Virginia. He followed me all over the country, and he was never judgmental of my work as a police officer. So great question, and took me down memory lane. Sorry if I went a little too long.
Oh, not a problem. Margaret Moe would like to know what's next for you. I know you said you were working on a prequel novel. What all is in the queue for you, shall we say?
Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to talking about the burden of truth, and I hope that eventually we'll be able to gather in bookstores and libraries and places like that. So this is something that I'm really enjoying, this engagement. I wish I could see everyone's faces and wish we could talk back and forth, but hopefully that time will come. But yeah, right now I'm working on a book that's under contract with my publisher, Forge. And if anyone's read The Benefit of Doubt, there was a character in that book that, interestingly enough, was central to the story. His name's Lars Norgard, but he was a retired police officer who had suffered a stroke. So he'd actually lost the ability to speak or interact at all. So we really never were able to get inside Lars's head, but he is a very interesting character with a very colorful past. So we talked about it between my agent and my editor and the publishers, that it would be fun to go back and tell his story. So I'm setting that in 1970, a young Lars Norgard, who's a rookie police officer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And interesting in the writing process, I reached out to a couple of buddies that used to work in Milwaukee, and they found me an my age, I guess, a retired lieutenant from Milwaukee Police Department who was a rookie in 1970. And he has just turned out, he's just the most colorful character, and he's got great stories, and he's really been able to inject a lot of life into the character of Lars. So I won't go too far into the plot, but basically it's a coming of age story, if you will. And it's set in 1970, a very turbulent time, not only in our public, but in police work. So I'm living there a lot. I'm living a lot in the past, and it's been a lot of fun. That book is, that's still in the creation process, but that's what's coming next.
So I have a question here about your writing schedule. Now that's the next book. You asked about that too, but and I'll add a bit to that, because you and I have talked about this before. Because when you were a working cop, you used to have to get up at 4:30 in the morning, if I remember right. You told me, and that's because that's the only time when your kids were young you could get time quiet to write. Now you're living this life of luxury and retirement. What's your writing schedule like now?
It's funny is and I don't know why, Rich, but I haven't changed it. And I could. You're right. I absolutely could. I could get up at 9 and write or something. I could just shut the office door or whatever I want to do. But for whatever reason, I've stuck with it. I still think that the best time for me as a writer, and I hear really successful writers that are all over the board with this, but for me, it's that quiet time in the morning before your mind has kind of gone off into the modern world or the real world. It's no exaggeration to say that writers hang out with their imaginary friends. That's what we do. That's who the characters are to us. It's like Sylvester Stallone said, he owes all his success to his very good friend Rocky Balboa. And you have to stop for a minute and go, wait a minute, Rocky's not real, but I can guarantee you to Sylvester, he's very real. So I think that for whatever reason, what works for me is to get up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, as I said, in the quiet of the morning before I start any of the family stuff, and just write for 2 or 3 hours. But I am finding now, particularly with our schedules the way they are, and there's usually a house full of people, that I might, again, you could sneak off later in the day or something like that. There's no interruptions of school. There's no interruptions of baseball practice or those sorts of things. So, but for me, the best time is still those early morning hours. It's just a hard habit to break.
Is it a word count that you have, or a page count? I mean, what's the parameter for you for you're saying, okay, I did the thing I needed to do today?
Well, what do they say, that 1,000 words a day for a year is a book, and 1,000 words for the rest of your life is a career, right? So I try and aim for somewhere between good words now. I mean, just solid stuff, somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500 words a day, and then. But knowing the process, that can very easily become 500 words that you're actually going to wind up in your finished novel. So, but I try and set that standard of about, on a good day, I'll write 2,000 words. And what's really fun then is once you get through the manuscript, and people ask me if I outline, and my answer is yes. It's called the first draft, because that's about what a first draft is worth. Going back and rewriting it, going back and polishing it, going back and figuring out what the order of events are. In fact, it's funny that in the Burden of Truth, I would tell you that the opening scene is where Omar finds himself on the business end of a no-knock SWAT raid. And that was originally, if you do it chronologically, that comes in the middle of the book. But what I decided was to open with the SWAT raid on his house. So what you're meeting is a young man who's being arrested for killing a cop. And you wonder, who is this kid? Well, then chapter 1 goes back 24 hours and we meet the real Omar Ortega. So those sorts of developments are going to come really late in the process. So I do try and get in a couple thousand words a day, but in the end, what really matters is the polishing and trying to put the story in the most compelling form you can get it.
Dave Friedland asked, this is a great question.
Hey,
Alfred
Dave.
Hitchcock would sometimes do a cameo role in his movies, maybe as a butler or something in the background, or a walkthrough. I always remember that. Have you ever placed yourself or created a character that's based on you, that you put into one of your books as a background character? You know,
I think maybe it's just true of cops, but I think there's always a certain amount of autobiographical material in there. I'm no Travis Jackson, but we have some things in common. People say that Tia Suarez is just a female version of my wife, Olga Diaz. So I don't know if that's true or not, just a really gutsy young Latina. But for myself, like I said, well, for instance, there's I think a really great scene in The Burden of Truth that's about a patrol briefing. And, you know, I love the Sergeant Pena, who comes in and takes charge. I'd love to be like Sergeant Pena. I think I might have had some days where I could pull off the kind of briefing he runs. But so I think I aspire to be like some of the cops that I write. I don't know that I actually do or not.
Do you have any least favorite characters?
Well, of course, in Benefit of the Doubt, it's so funny because there's a really dirty cop in Benefit of the Doubt, my novel from 2015, named Doyle McKenzie. And I still have people trying to figure out who Doyle McKenzie is, and he is an absolute creation of fiction. I mean, he's a terrible, horrible individual that should never have been a police officer. So he's completely, in my world, complete fiction. But people are always trying to determine who he was. So that was probably my least favorite. But again, he's just a dirty cop.
You know, one of the things I also really admire about you and some of the other writers that are in this Southern California, and of course I'm not in Southern California, but the community of people that I've got to know in your part of the world, there's a real collegiality, you know, among writers. Mm-hmm. You mentioned it earlier. It's such an individual pursuit, and nothing. There's no writer's book. There's no video. There's nothing that is more important than just putting your butt in the chair and writing. But at some point, you know, you really do need to have the ability to reach out to other writers, share ideas, bounce things off their head. And, you know, most writers are pretty good. Some writers are not. You've always been one of the really good ones. Talk a little bit about this little circle and how it helps you become a better writer, develop these stories. And part of my thinking is there's probably not a lot of these things where you could go sit down when you were on the job and talk to officers about this, because that's not their thing, right? But you always need to be able to talk to other writers. So tell me a little bit about how that may or may not have helped you over the years.
Well, for sure, that is the case. You know, writing conferences are great. You get to go to go be at a writers conference either before I published or since, and to interact with writers in their own world. It is very helpful. It does make me think, though, that I remember it was probably now, I guess, 15 years ago that I was in a local bookstore and I picked up a book off the top of the discount pile, and it had a neat cover, and it was called A World of Thieves by some fellow named James Carlos Blake. And I read that book and I just devoured it. And I literally read everything he ever wrote. And I know that if I hadn't picked up that book, if I hadn't become introduced to that particular writer, I don't think I ever would have been a writer. But I was so enthralled by his style, and he's a very literary crime fiction writer. But that's what really kind of got me going as a writer. And as we went along, one thing led to another, and through a lot of different happenstance, I guess, circumstances, he's gotten to be a friend. He's gotten to be a very close friend and a mentor, if you will. So having an opportunity to interact with the writers, whether it be Blake or Don Winslow, who lives here in San Diego County, or for that matter, getting to meet Joe Wampau, who kind of, influenced my life very early on. T. Jefferson Parker, Jeff Parker, another great writer. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Rich, that writers that have mentored me, and now I'd like to think, and I know that it's true at some level, I'm able to, if nothing else, with my understanding of the publishing industry, and on my fourth novel, I'm able to mentor developing writers. And I often hear from people who are in the process of writing, or I've been in writing groups. I've done a lot of presentations to writing classes, and I think that is a really valuable part of the equation. And when you're that emerging writer, that developing writer, I certainly owe any success I've had to the writers I just mentioned. And I remember when Tess Gerritsen read A Voice from the Field for me, and also By His Own Hand, and she just really has enjoyed the character of Tia Suarez. So when, in fact, she was the one who mentioned early on that she said, I really like Tia, you should put her center stage. And that's exactly where Tia wound up in A Voice from the Field. So yeah, you depend a lot on those mentoring relationships.
You mentioned to me that the current story, Burden of Truth, would have been very, very difficult for you to write while you were still active duty. Mm-hmm. Is there another story that you would like to tell that's been kicking around in your head, not the one you're working on, but maybe the timing wasn't right or what have you, that you still want to get to that's down the road, you just haven't got there yet?
There's a couple of ruminating, and I think you bring up an interesting point. Is I wouldn't have been comfortable. I wouldn't have written. I didn't like writing crime fiction as an active duty cop. When I wrote Benefit of the Doubt, I was still working, and like most writers, I never actually expected maybe it would be published someday, but it actually ended up being published fairly quickly, and then it did very well. It was on the LA Times bestseller list for a couple of months, so there was no keeping that a secret. And then my publisher said, basically, do it again. So I had to make that decision. Okay, am I going to be a writer, or am I going to be a cop? Because like I said, when you're in public service, you pretty much keep your opinion to yourself. So that's where I decided that even at just 27 years, instead of going the distance of 30 years, I'd retire a little early. And that did free me up. And I would never have written a story about, I would never go out and talk, for me personally, go out and talk about San Diego law enforcement as a working lieutenant or a working police officer. I just would have been conflicted by that. But with that conflict removed, yeah, there are other stories that, in fact, I hope that Travis can be the center of some additional dramas. And his character, I think, is developed well enough that I could use him as the vehicle to tell some more stories that, yeah, they're definitely kicking around in my head.
So I have to ask you, Tia, mm-hmm. You've noted more than once that there's definitely some connection to Olga, your wife. How has that played out at home? Is she okay with that comparison if people bring that up, or does that get you one of those looks that all of us husbands go, I wish I hadn't done that?
No, I never make the connection. I just always hear the connection, and I'll admit maybe there's some truth to it. I mean, yeah, I'm married to a woman who's a very outspoken, very strong-willed Latina who pretty much takes on the world every day, and Tia has those qualities. So you tell me. I'm not a psychologist, but yeah, there's probably some connection there somewhere, and I don't think anybody could find any fault in Tia Suarez. I mean, she's got her issues for sure, but if it did happen, like I said, I think biography often slips its way in there into the creative process for sure.
You know, I also want to ask you about short stories, and I will remind everybody too, if you have, we still have some time for a few more questions. We're getting toward the end, but if you have some questions, please hit us up. Let me ask you about short stories. You recently turned me on to Don Winslow's book of short novellas, which was just fantastic. It's a form I love. I love anthologies. I love short stories. And I love crime fiction. There's a lot of really good ones out there, and they're a great proving ground. They're a great experimental place. Do you invest much time in writing short stories, or is that something that interests you at all?
I never have. My first experiment with writing, at least creatively, was The Benefit of Doubt. And it's funny because when I thought Benefit of Doubt was ready to hit the shelf, I think it was 135,000 words, and it was just all over the place. But I had it edited early on, a freelance editor, Emily Heckman, and she said it needed a little bit more time on the shelf at home. And it went from like 140,000 words down to 92,000, I think, when it was published. And so that was my first writing experiment. So I haven't written short stories. The ones you're referring to, Winslow's new book, Broken, they're just fabulous stories. And I like I said, I look at them as kind of a beloved story with California. They're all based in California, and they're just, I think one might be Texas, but they're all just terrific stories. That's something I wouldn't mind trying, though. I think short stories are a really fun reading opportunity. The gentleman I already mentioned, James Carlos Blake, he has a selections right over here on my desk called Borderlands, and it's another terrific section or selection of Southwest crime stories. So yeah, it's something I might give it a shot in the future.
I think you'd be fabulous at it, because I'm sure you have vastly more material than you have time to develop into full-on stories, and I think you'd be really good at it. I'm thinking too, going back to inspirational things. Clearly, you have a lot of experiences from the job, and you've mentioned your wife is out there in a very high-profile job every single day. You're very involved in the world. Is that where you get most of the inspiration? Is it just stuff that you experienced on the job, or how good are you at taking something else that you see somewhere that moves you in some way and saying, I'm going to develop a story on that?
Well, what that makes me think about is the fact that, again, the way I was brought up, with books being a really central part of our world, story, the power of story. That is the ultimate way that we communicate, or that we connect to each other, is through the power of a well-told story, whether it's biographical or literary nonfiction or literary fiction, or in my case, genre crime fiction. I think I was brought up in a way that I just really have an appreciation for the power of a well-told story, and not necessarily mine, but there's nothing that connects me to other people's world more than that. I think back to being a kid reading a Stephen King novel, and my dad came over, and I think it was one of the ones in the 70s. He wrote a lot, but he took it away from me and says, "What are you reading this for?" And he gave me Native Son by Richard Wright and said, "Read this instead." And I not only read Richard Wright, but then after that experience, I went and found Black Boy and read that. And and growing up in a world where 99% of the people in a small town in Wisconsin look exactly like me, to read the experiences of a young African-American young man growing up in the South in the 40s, it really started opening my eyes to the outside world. And and then I had similar experiences reading Jack London or Willa Cather or so many others. So I guess what I'm saying, Rich, is just that to me, there's always potential for story. When you sit down and you listen to how other people are living their lives, and of course as police officers, you get material just thrown at you every day. And that's certainly where Omar comes from. I don't write Omar without the experiences I had in the police department. But I think what I would want to leave people with is the reason I wrote the book is so that they can hopefully, through the power of a story, reflect, as we said, on the idea of walking around another person's shoes for a little while. So I think they're all out there. All the stories are out there, and it's just a matter of trying to put it together and share it with people.
Maybe we have time for a few more here. I hope I get this name correct. Quay or Quai Corti. I apologize if I massacred that. Have you surprised yourself with something you've learned as you write about someone who is so unlike yourself?
Great question. I think there's characters in this book and The Burden of Truth that really challenged me. There's a gentleman who's a journalist in The Burden of Truth, Joaquin Fonseca. And I actually interviewed a gentleman that I know pretty well through Telemundo. And that character was kind of late in development, but I really like him. And I really think that he is just an integral part of the story. And that I guess, kind of surprised me as how much of a role he ended up taking. and just how much respect I really have for him. I think he's just he does a really important job in this book, and so yeah, I think his development just almost shocked me as the person who was just kind of creating him from the ground up.
And do you read any nonfiction other than the news, of course, which we've talked about? And if so, what is it that you like? What is it that gets on your bookshelf?
I like biography a lot. I was just reading recently. I think it was Kirkus put out a list of books that were older books that were worth reading, and one of them was a biography by Joe Louis, the boxer. So he grew up. His parents were sharecroppers in Alabama, and they, with the Great Migration in the 40s, moved up to I think in Chicago. But anyway, he just had a very interesting life story. So I enjoy biography. And I try and read my genre. I try and read my genre a lot. And so I usually have one or two going at a time.
Would you ever consider writing a biography of somebody that interests you?
I am intrigued by not only biography, but the field of literary nonfiction, kind of in the vein of In Cold Blood sort of material. And certainly a couple, I'm trying to remember a couple of that Wampau wrote that were based on real events. So creative nonfiction is something that's really interesting to me. But I tell you what, it's fun to just be able to make it all up, right? It's a lot easier. It cuts down on the research time. So writing pure fiction is very liberating. Whereas if you're going to take on something like a biography or something like creative nonfiction, yeah, you're going to have to be ready to do the research.
So pure fiction, I have to address something with you here, because so David Simon, who I'm sure you know, former reporter for many years, wrote The Wire, wrote Treme, other things. Mm-hmm. There's a scene in The Wire where a character jumps out of the 4th story of a parking garage to get away from some guys who are trying to kill him, and he survives. Everybody's amazed. So Simon said later on, well, people would approach him and say, that couldn't possibly have happened. That wasn't true. Da 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 da. And he said, well, you're right. The character that the real person I based this on, that's true. He didn't jump out of the 4th story of this parking garage. He actually jumped out of the 6th story. But if I wrote that, nobody would ever believe it. So it makes me ask, have you seen things as a cop where you would just say, I know it happened, I maybe even saw it happen, but there's no way I can include that, because the average person would just roll their eyes and go, now Neal's jumped the shark. There's no way that's real.
I would say probably in every book I've written, only 4, but there are scenes that are based on or there are nuggets of truth that are surrounded by fiction. But that nugget, yeah, people would have a difficult time believing either the how demented people can be, or also how heroic people can be as well. So yeah, that's certainly the case. I think most writers have that experience.
Well, I need to hand this back over to Cindy now. I'm probably a little late. Sorry, guys. And I know Cindy has a lot to say to folks. So, hey, Neal, thanks a lot. It was great talking to you.
Good seeing you again, Rich. Talk to you later.
Thank you both. It was wonderful to have Neal Griffin and Rich Ehisen. And this is our first Collecting Clues. As Mary Elizabeth said, we're excited that so many people joined us. Thank you for everyone that joined us, but especially our Mystery Committee and our authors. That was a wonderful treat to see you come up.
Well, please be sure. Cindy, I'm looking forward to the next one, and I'm just gonna watch next time. That'll be a lot of fun.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Please be sure to go to the chat if you're looking for the link to buy books. We've posted quite a number of them, but particularly Neal's Burden of Truth and Rich's birthday book in their own words, I believe. Yeah. Thank you. So if you'd like to unmute and say goodbye, please do. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and please watch for another Collecting Clues.
And I'd love to hear from you all. nealgriffin.com, and it'd be if you want to just drop me an email or get me on Facebook. I love talking. It's best we can do right now, right? So stay in touch, everyone. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you, guys.
Before we leave, I do want to mention that Neal will be personalizing books. for anyone who would like a signed personalized edition, when you place your order through Creating Conversations, just put your inscription requirements in the comments section. And Neal will be signing them on Monday, so please get your orders in no later than noon on Monday. Thank you. And thank you to our authors very, very much.
It was great. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.